It began with a sound so low that no human ear could hear it, yet every living thing in the ocean felt it instantly, like a bruise forming deep inside bone. At 0217 a.m., when most of the world slept and the sea was at its calmest, a classified deep-sea communication array awakened beneath the Pacific. Engineers called it a test pulse, a harmless experiment designed to echo through the deepest trenches and return data. But the ocean did not hear a test. The ocean heard a knock. The pulse slid downward through miles of black water, compressing under pressure, stretching into something slower, heavier, deliberate. Sensors began to spike, not with noise, but with silence. Entire frequencies vanished, swallowed as if something vast had opened its mouth around the sound itself. Marine life reacted before machines did. Whales altered migration routes mid-song. Squid erupted from the depths in blind panic. Every creature that knew how to flee did so, as if an ancestral memory had been triggered, one that screamed a single ancient truth. Something that should never wake up had just been called by name. On board the research vessel Artemis 9, technicians stared at their monitors as the pulse failed to return. No echo, no reflection, just absence. Then the water beneath the ship began to hum, not audibly, but structurally, a vibration that crawled through steel and up into the soles of their feet. Sonar operators adjusted gain, then froze. A shape was forming, not appearing suddenly, but assembling itself piece by piece, like a shadow remembering how to exist. It wasn't rising fast, it wasn't charging, it was approaching with the patience of something that had waited millions of years and could afford to wait a little longer. The algorithms rejected the data again and again, flagging it as impossible, rewriting it as terrain, as error, as fiction, until the system finally issued a warning no one had ever seen before: unclassifiable mass, source depth unknown. At that moment, a second pulse answered the first. Not identical, not random, changed, adjusted, as if whatever lay below had listened, learned, and replied. The captain ordered engines to idle. Silence spread across the deck, thick and unnatural. Even the waves seemed to still. The second pulse rolled upward, slower than the first, carrying weight, intention, and something far worse than aggression: recognition. Linguistic software activated automatically, parsing the rhythm, the spacing, the intervals between vibrations. The screen flashed a result that made one technician step back as if burned. Pattern structure detected, non-random, responsive. This was no animal cry, no seismic echo. This was communication shaped by something that understood cause and effect, call and answer. Beneath the Artemis 9, miles below light and law, something ancient had just confirmed that it was not alone anymore, and that it had noticed us. And then the signal stopped. Not faded, not ended. Stopped. As if the ocean itself had gone quiet to listen. For centuries, humans told themselves a comforting lie: that the past was dead, that anything too large, too violent, too ancient to control must surely be extinct. The Megalodon became a museum exhibit, a diagram in textbooks, a myth sharpened into teeth for children's stories. Science declared it impossible. The oceans had changed, the food chains collapsed, the temperature shifted. There was no room left for a monster of that scale. And so humanity grew bold, drilling deeper, listening louder, shouting into the abyss with machines that did not understand the difference between curiosity and challenge. The fatal mistake was not arrogance alone. It was certainty. Certainty that the ocean had no memory. Certainty that nothing was listening. The truth, buried beneath layers of classified data and deliberate omissions, was far darker. The signal sent by Artemis 9 was not humanity's first call into the deep. It was simply the first one loud enough to be understood. Decades earlier, unexplained sonar shadows had appeared and vanished, dismissed as sensor ghosts. Submarines during the Cold War reported being followed by shapes too large to log, too slow to be weapons, too intelligent to be whales. Each incident was sealed, buried, explained away, not because commanders didn't believe their crews, but because believing meant admitting something had survived us, something had adapted, something had learned to stay beneath the threshold of our attention. What humanity never considered was that extinction is a human concept, not a natural one. In the crushing depths where pressure shatters steel and darkness erases time, size is not a weakness, it is protection. Heat blooms from the Earth's wounds, feeding ecosystems older than land itself. Down there, the Megalodon did not need to compete. It did not need to evolve smaller. It needed only to become quieter, slower, patient. While humans mapped coastlines and satellites traced clouds, the true depths remained untouched, vast enough to hide gods. The greatest error came when scientists assumed intelligence must look like ours to be recognized. They searched for tools, structures, aggression. They never searched for restraint. The Megalodon did not rise for centuries because it did not need to. It hunted selectively, feeding where humans could not see, avoiding noise, learning patterns of steel and sonar. Every passing submarine was a lesson, every drifting cable a map, every war fought above was studied below. The ocean became its archive, and humanity, unknowingly, became its subject. When the pulse finally reached it, the reaction was not rage, it was confirmation. Confirmation that the surface species had grown loud enough to be worth acknowledging, that the creatures who once feared the sea had begun knocking on doors they didn't know existed. The Megalodon did not answer immediately because it was not deciding whether to attack. It was deciding whether humanity had become a threat or an opportunity. That pause, that terrible silence after the first signal, was not emptiness. It was judgment being passed by something that remembered a world before humans learned to name themselves. The twist, hidden in encrypted research logs, was almost too disturbing to share. Paleontologists had been wrong, not because the Megalodon died out, but because it changed roles. Fossil records showed violent feeding patterns near the surface, but modern deep-sea scars found on titanic carcasses told a different story. Controlled kills, strategic feeding, minimal movement. This was no mindless predator clinging to survival. This was an apex intelligence optimizing existence. Extinction never happened. Ascension did. And when humanity finally made itself heard clearly enough, the mistake was sealed. The signal did not summon a monster. It announced our location. Somewhere far below, older than history and heavier than fear, something understood a simple truth at last. The surface had become noisy, and noisy things eventually reveal themselves. The Artemis 9 did not officially exist. Its name appeared nowhere in shipping registries, maritime insurance records, or satellite traffic logs. On paper, it was a weather research vessel decommissioned 2 years earlier and quietly sold for scrap. In reality, it was reborn in silence, retrofitted in a closed naval dock under blackout conditions, its hull layered with classified composites designed to reduce sonar reflection, its decks stripped of any insignia that could tie it to a nation. Every crew member signed documents that did not promise secrecy, but erasure. If something went wrong, the world would never know they were there. And that knowledge hung over the ship like a curse long before it reached open water. The crew was not told the full mission. They never were. Scientists were briefed only on their individual tasks: monitor acoustic returns, calibrate pressure sensors, maintain deep-sea microphones, observe anomalies without interpretation. The military personnel on board were given different orders entirely. Observe the scientists, record emotional responses, flag anyone who hesitated when data stopped making sense. This was not exploration. It was an experiment layered on top of another experiment, each group believing they were the observers while unknowingly being observed themselves. That was the first sign that someone, somewhere, already expected failure. The coordinates they were given led them far beyond standard shipping lanes, into a region of the Pacific where maps blurred and depth readings refused to stabilize. Official charts showed nothing unusual, just ocean, endless and deep. But older naval maps, the kind that never made it into public databases, marked the area with a thin red ring and a single word written in faded ink: void. The trench beneath them was not part of any known geological formation. It did not follow tectonic logic. Its walls dropped too steeply, its depth changed too abruptly, as if the Earth itself had torn open there and never healed. As the Artemis 9 crossed into the zone, systems began behaving strangely, not failing, adjusting. Sonar pings returned slower than expected, stretched, warped, as though the sound itself were struggling to travel through the water. Temperature gradients inverted without explanation. Pressure sensors recorded fluctuations that suggested massive displacement far below, yet no seismic activity accompanied them. The ocean was moving, but the planet was not. That contradiction unsettled even the most hardened technicians, though none of them voiced it aloud. Silence had become an unspoken survival instinct. The captain, a man selected not for brilliance but for obedience, received a final encrypted transmission just before communications were cut to one-way mode. It contained no instructions, only a historical archive: Cold War sonar logs, missing submarine reports, audio recordings labeled "Unresolved Biological Contact." He listened to one file, alone in his cabin, headphones pressed tight as the ship's engines hummed beneath his feet. What played back was not noise, not static, but a slow, rhythmic pressure wave, so deep it felt more like gravity than sound. At the end of the recording, a shaken voice whispered, "It stayed below us the entire time, like it was learning." The captain closed the file and deleted it, but the sound did not leave him. It followed him onto the bridge, into his sleep, into the decisions he would soon regret. Night fell unnaturally fast over the trench. Clouds rolled in without warning, blotting out stars and moon alike, leaving the ship floating in a pocket of black, so complete it felt artificial. The sea was calm, too calm. No waves broke against the hull, no wind stirred the air. It was as if the surface itself had been placed under observation. When the first deep-sea microphone was lowered, its cable descended smoothly, meter after meter, vanishing into darkness. At 3,000 meters, it stopped transmitting ambient noise altogether. At 4,000, it began to record something else: breathing. Not the erratic pulses of whales or the mechanical churn of currents, but long, slow pressure shifts, expansion and contraction on a scale too vast to belong to any known organism. The rhythm was steady, patient, alive. When the data streamed across the monitors, one of the junior analysts laughed nervously and suggested a software glitch. No one joined him. The room had gone still again, that same suffocating quiet that now seemed to follow every anomaly. The ship was no longer alone, and everyone felt it in different ways. Tightness in the chest, headaches, sudden irrational fear, the sensation of being watched from below. As the array descended deeper, the breathing changed. It synchronized, not with the ocean, but with the ship itself, matching the hum of engines, the pulse of generators, the rhythm of human activity above. Something below was aligning itself, tuning in, adjusting to the presence overhead. This was not random biology reacting to disturbance. This was attention. And attention, the crew would soon learn, was far more dangerous than aggression. The first full sonar sweep nearly broke the system. The return signal came back fragmented, overwhelmed by scale. The object beneath them was not rising directly. It was positioning, sliding laterally through the trench, keeping pace with the ship without closing distance, maintaining depth with impossible precision. When the AI attempted to render its outline, the model failed repeatedly, crashing under the sheer size of the mass. One technician whispered a word he immediately wished he hadn't: Megalodon. The term hung in the air like a profanity. The lead scientist snapped at him, reminding everyone that extinction was not a debate, it was a fact. But the data did not care about facts. Then came the twist no one anticipated. A second shape appeared, smaller, faster, moving with purpose. It circled the larger mass like a scout, darting upward briefly before retreating back into the trench. The implication was horrifying. This was not a solitary survivor, not a relic clinging to existence. This was a structure, a hierarchy, a system of behavior that suggested coordination. The Artemis 9 was not hovering over a sleeping giant. It was hovering over a domain. Military analysts on board quietly changed threat levels without informing the scientists. Protocols shifted, recording frequencies widened. Weapon systems, officially non-existent, were armed and then immediately powered down when the sonar pulses below changed again. The response was subtle but unmistakable. The movement beneath them slowed, tightened, as if something had noticed the shift in intent above and was adjusting its own posture accordingly. The final horror of the expedition came not from the depths, but from within the ship itself. Crew members began experiencing the same dream independently, standing on deck, staring down into black water, feeling an immense presence directly beneath them, not hostile, not angry, but aware. When medical officers compared notes, panic spread. Shared hallucinations were impossible, but this was no hallucination. It was influence. Whether through sound, pressure, or something not yet understood, the deep was reaching upward, touching human minds with the lightest possible contact, testing boundaries, measuring response. By the time the captain ordered preparation for the primary signal deployment, it no longer felt like a decision. It felt like an inevitability. The Artemis 9 had crossed a line long ago. The trench had accepted its presence, and somewhere far below, something ancient was no longer hiding. It was waiting. The first rule drilled into every sonar operator is simple. The ocean always lies, but it never lies consistently. False echoes flicker, noise collapses, glitches contradict themselves. Real objects persist. They obey rules. When the new contact appeared beneath the Artemis 9, it obeyed none of the known rules, and that was what terrified them most. At first, it looked like terrain. A broad, sloping mass stretching across the trench floor, too large and too smooth to be a living thing. The software tagged it automatically as a geological anomaly, coloring it a neutral gray, filing it away as unremarkable. The lead sonar technician almost accepted it. Almost, until he noticed something wrong with the edges. Terrain does not breathe. This contact expanded and contracted by fractions of a degree, so subtle that only someone who had spent years staring at sonar returns would catch it. The change wasn't random, it was rhythmic. When the technician adjusted the gain, the shape did not sharpen, it multiplied. The display filled with overlapping arcs, stacked like shadows cast by something too vast for a single reflection. The object wasn't a point or even a mass, it was a presence that bent the sonar field itself, warping sound the way gravity warps light. Pings sent downward returned late, stretched thin, or failed to return at all, as if swallowed. The system recalibrated again and again, desperately trying to fit what it was seeing into a framework that no longer applied. One of the scientists whispered, "That's not possible," and the machine answered by crashing. When the display rebooted, the contact was still there. Closer. The captain ordered a full spectrum sweep, overriding safety limits designed to prevent equipment damage. The sonar pulse tore downward through the trench, louder and deeper than any previous scan. For a split second, the ocean answered with nothing. An absence so complete it felt like blindness. Then the return came back all at once, slamming into the system with such force that alarms screamed across the bridge. The size estimate recalculated, and recalculated again. Each time, the numbers grew worse. The object beneath them was longer than any known whale, wider than a destroyer, heavier than the largest structures humanity had ever placed in the ocean. The AI flagged the data as a catastrophic error and attempted to discard it. When engineers forced it to retain the reading, the system generated a warning never intended for biological contacts. Mass exceeds modeled limits. The bridge fell silent. No one spoke because speaking would make it real. Then the object moved. Not upward, not away. It turned. The sonar image shifted subtly, the arcs reorienting themselves with deliberate precision. Whatever lay below was not drifting with currents or responding reflexively to noise. It was repositioning itself relative to the ship, aligning its body in a way that suggested awareness of where the Artemis 9 was, not just in space, but in relation to itself. The implication was chilling. The creature understood perspective. As if to prove it, the contact began to circle, slowly, perfectly, maintaining a constant distance and depth, pacing the ship like a predator matching steps with prey it had no intention of killing yet. The motion was so smooth it defied biology. Large creatures should move with effort, with inertia. This thing moved like an idea, effortless, controlled, patient. The sonar trace formed a ring around the vessel, enclosing it in an invisible boundary no one could see, but everyone could feel. Crew members began to report physical symptoms, pressure headaches, vertigo, a sensation of heaviness in the chest, as if gravity itself had increased. Medical officers found nothing wrong. The ship's structure, however, told a different story. Stress sensors embedded in the hull registered microstrains along the keel, responding not to impact, but to proximity. The water around the ship had grown denser, not physically, but acoustically, compressed by the presence below. Then came the second reading. A smaller contact appeared above the massive one, darting briefly into range before vanishing again. Then another. And another. Each one was fast, agile, unmistakably alive. Scouts. The realization spread through the bridge like poison. The enormous mass below was not alone, and it was not the most active thing in the water. It was the center. The sonar operator's voice shook as he spoke. "Sir, it's not avoiding our scans anymore." The implication hit hard. It had been avoiding them before. The creature, or whatever classification no longer applied, allowed the sonar to see it now, revealing just enough to communicate scale without offering clarity, like lifting a corner of a curtain and letting the imagination do the rest. The AI attempted to reconstruct a three-dimensional model and failed repeatedly, each time producing a shape so vast and distorted it bordered on the obscene. Teat appeared where they shouldn't. Negative space formed where mass should be. The model collapsed under its own contradictions. Then, the contact did something no one expected. It stopped moving. The circling ceased instantly, freezing the sonar image mid-arc. The ocean went quiet again, not naturally quiet, but deliberately so, as if every current and creature within miles had been stilled. The silence pressed in, heavy and intentional. For a long moment, nothing happened. And then the sonar pulse was returned. Not echoed, returned. The frequency that came back was altered, shifted just enough to prove it had been received, analyzed, and modified. This was no passive reflection, it was mimicry. The creature below had listened to humanity's voice in the deep and learned how to speak back, not in sound, but in structure. The return pattern was clean, precise, and devastating in its implication. One of the linguistics programs activated on its own. Adaptive response detected. That was when panic finally broke containment. Orders overlapped, scientists argued, military personnel demanded escalation protocols. The captain stood frozen, staring at the display as if it were a window instead of a screen. He knew with absolute clarity, that the reading was not a threat assessment. It was an introduction. The object below was not attacking because it didn't need to. It had already demonstrated superiority of scale, control of environment, and cognitive response. This was dominance expressed through restraint, a message without violence. You exist. I see you. I decide what happens next. As if to underline the point, the sonar display briefly flickered, and for a single frame, the mass beneath them shifted shape, resolving into a suggestion of form that made several crew members look away in instinctive horror. A curve that might have been a jaw, a void that might have been an eye, or perhaps neither, perhaps something worse. Then the image vanished. The contact dropped deeper, retreating beyond sensor range with impossible speed, leaving behind a sonar field that took minutes to stabilize. The trench returned to silence, systems normalized, the ocean resumed its movements as if nothing had happened. But the ship did not feel relief, because now they understood the truth. The sonar reading was never meant to measure the creature, it was meant to measure them. And somewhere far below, in a trench no map acknowledged, something vast had finished evaluating the surface species hovering above its domain, and had not yet decided whether they were worth eliminating or studying further. The most terrifying realization did not come with violence. It came with control. After the impossible sonar reading faded, the crew of the Artemis 9 waited for impact. For attack, for the sudden, catastrophic end that horror stories always promised. It never came. The ocean did not erupt. The hull did not buckle. Instead, the ship was allowed to exist. And that permission, unspoken and unexplained, was far worse than any immediate destruction. The contact returned slowly, deliberately, as if responding to an unasked question. Sonar picked it up again at a greater distance, deeper now, just at the edge of reliable detection. It wasn't retreating, it was repositioning itself into a place of advantage. The pattern was unmistakable. The massive presence remained directly beneath the ship's projected drift path, adjusting its position in advance, predicting movement before it happened. This was not instinct, this was calculation. The lead behavioral analyst, flown in under a false name and buried in layers of clearance, began to speak in a voice stripped of academic detachment. "Predators don't do this," she said quietly. "Animals react. This thing anticipates." Her words were met with silence because no one wanted to follow the thought to its end. Anticipation implied modeling. Modeling implied understanding, and understanding implied something far closer to intelligence than anyone was prepared to acknowledge. The creature began to test them. It started small. Minor pressure waves nudged the hull, not enough to cause damage, just enough to register. The ship's stress sensors lit up briefly, then returned to green, a warning without consequence. When no response followed, the next test came differently. Sonar readings distorted suddenly, not randomly, but selectively. Certain frequencies vanished while others amplified, as if something below was exploring which senses mattered most to the surface dwellers. When the crew switched frequencies, the distortion followed instantly, adapting in real time. The message was clear: I can see how you see. Sleep became impossible. Crew members reported the same sensation night after night, the feeling of being watched from directly below, of something immense lying just out of sight, waiting. Some dreamed of falling endlessly through dark water, only to stop inches above a vast, unmoving shape. Others dreamed of standing on the ocean floor, impossibly uncrushed by pressure, while something circled them slowly, studying their reactions. The dreams were not symbolic, they were rehearsals. Medical scans showed elevated stress hormones across the entire crew, synchronized spikes occurring at the same times despite physical separation. The ship's psychologists suggested mass hysteria. The data disagreed. The spikes coincided precisely with subtle changes in sonar returns, variations too slight to consciously register, yet strong enough to be felt by the body. The conclusion was unavoidable. The crew was being influenced, their nervous systems gently probed through sound and pressure. This was not communication in language. This was communication in biology. The creature demonstrated restraint again when a supply drone was deployed. The unmanned vehicle descended smoothly, lights cutting narrow cones through the darkness. Sonar tracked it easily until the contact shifted. The massive presence moved closer, surrounding the drone's descent path without touching it. The water around the drone grew unstable, currents bending in unnatural ways. Cameras showed shadows sliding just beyond the light, always staying out of view, perfectly positioned to remain unseen. Then, deliberately, the drone was nudged. Not crushed, not destroyed, turned. The machine rotated slowly, its cameras now pointed upward, directly at the Artemis 9. The feed transmitted back to the bridge, the ship's own silhouette floating above, framed by darkness. The drone was released moments later, allowed to continue its descent unharmed. The implication landed with brutal clarity. I know where you are. I know what you are looking at. I decide what you see. No animal behavior model could explain this behavior. Predators kill probes. Territorial creatures attack intrusions. Curiosity-driven animals investigate erratically. This behavior was structured, hierarchical. The massive presence remained central and still, while smaller contacts, those fast-moving shapes, handled interaction. Observers, enforcers, perhaps something else entirely. The Artemis 9 wasn't facing a lone survivor of a prehistoric species. It was facing a system. The next test came when the ship attempted to withdraw. Engines increased power slightly, altering course just enough to test whether the contact would follow. It did. Instantly. The massive presence adjusted position beneath the new projected route, matching the ship's movement before it completely committed to the turn. The timing was impossible, unless the creature had already predicted the decision, not reacted to it, anticipated it. Somewhere below, something was running scenarios. The captain ordered a full stop. The contact stopped too. That was the moment fear crystallized into certainty. This was not dominance through strength. It was dominance through understanding. The creature did not need to demonstrate what it could do. It had already demonstrated that escape was optional and not permitted. The ocean around them had become a controlled space, an arena whose boundaries were defined by something older and vastly more capable than anything aboard the ship. The twist came quietly, hidden in a data stream almost overlooked. Acoustic analysts noticed that the pressure patterns around the ship were not uniform. The creature wasn't just surrounding the vessel, it was shaping the environment, dampening certain waveforms, amplifying others. The ocean itself had become a medium of control. In effect, the ship was sitting inside a constructed sensory bubble, isolated from the wider ocean. An enclosure. Not a trap, not yet. A containment field. That realization reframed everything. The creature wasn't deciding whether to kill them, it was deciding what they were. Threat? tool, curiosity, or a message? The restraint made sense now. Killing would end the experiment. Allowing survival extended it. The final test of intelligence came without warning. All sonar went dark. Not failed, not jammed. Dark. Every acoustic return vanished simultaneously, replaced by a uniform void. The ocean ceased to exist on their screens. For the first time since entering the trench, the crew was blind. Panic surged, but beneath it was something colder. Understanding. Whatever controlled the depths just removed humanity's primary sense. Minutes passed. Then, one signal returned. A single, perfectly clean pulse, originating from directly below the ship. It was not hostile, not loud. It was an invitation, or a command. The Artemis 9 floated in silence, its crew finally grasping the true horror of their situation. They were not explorers, they were not invaders. They were subjects. And the intelligence beneath them was no longer hiding the fact that it knew exactly what it was doing. Somewhere in the crushing dark below, something ancient continued to wait, patient and precise, having learned enough to proceed to the next phase. Silence had become unbearable on the Artemis 9. For hours, the crew had been floating over a trench that defied measurement, a void that seemed alive in its stillness. Sonar readings flickered intermittently, only to return blank screens, and yet the technicians felt it all. The faint vibrations in the hull, subtle currents shifting against their feet, the unshakable sensation of being observed. No one spoke. No one moved more than necessary. Something below had become aware of them, and that awareness had weight. Then, precisely at 0347 a.m., the first real communication began, not through machines, not through sound, but through pressure. It started subtly. Sonar pulses returned with timing slightly off from expectations. Not random error, not environmental interference, but intentional shifts in frequency. The lead technician froze, eyes wide. It's responding, he whispered, voice barely audible over the soft hum of the engines. The words hung in the cabin like a spell. The return pulses were structured, patterned, calculated. Something down there wasn't just moving, it was thinking. The AI interpreted the data first. It classified the returning waves as non-random, adaptive. The system flagged the signals repeatedly, trying to fit them into existing models. Impossible. No marine life behaved like this. No animal had ever demonstrated this level of comprehension. The pulses repeated, accelerating in complex sequences, almost forming a code. The software predicted continuity, tried to extrapolate the next waveforms, and failed. The algorithm's failure wasn't more than a warning, it was proof. Something below was responding to the human's actions, shaping a message from the ocean itself. The crew stared at the monitors, speechless. They had crossed into an abyss where biology and intelligence intersected in a form their brains could not fully process. The pulses were not violent, yet the atmosphere thickened with dread. The intelligence behind them was assessing everything, the ship's movement, the timing of the pings, even the reactions of those on deck. For the first time, the humans realized the terrifying reality. They were the subjects of study, not the explorers. The first words, or what might have been words, came indirectly. The pressure changes in the water beneath the ship fluctuated rhythmically, forming a sequence so consistent that the naval linguist software flagged it immediately. Non-random, repeatable, deliberate. It was not sound, not vibration alone. It was communication encoded into the very medium around them. The pattern suggested pauses, breaks, emphasis, like a language that had never been spoken, but had been meticulously constructed over millions of years of silence and observation. The first technician to attempt interpretation almost fainted when the sequence appeared to respond to his own manipulations of the sonar array. He sent a rapid series of pulses upward, testing whether the contact would react. The return came almost instantly, adjusting its rhythm to mirror, counter, and manipulate his own. The room fell silent again. Even the captain, normally immune to panic, leaned over the console trying to understand how a creature could perform such a feat. It's... it's thinking, he muttered. It knows exactly what we're doing. The entity did not attack, it did not breach. Instead, it conducted the first conversation with an intelligence older than humans had ever encountered. The pulses became longer, deeper, carrying a consistency that suggested not only awareness, but intent. Each sequence corresponded to a subtle environmental response: pressure waves bending, minor shifts in currents around the ship, localized temperature changes. The crew noticed immediately that the ship itself had become an instrument in a dialogue they could not hear, one that operated in a space where language was measured not in words, but in consequence and reaction. One of the analysts realized the pulses followed a structured pattern reminiscent of early human mathematics, sequences that resembled prime numbers paired with subtle timing shifts. The conclusion was chilling. It's sending a message in a logic we understand to see if we understand it, she said. Her voice trembled. It's testing our cognition. The implication was undeniable. The entity below wasn't acting on instinct. It was choosing methods designed specifically for human perception, selecting stimuli that humans could interpret, then observing responses. As the dialogue continued, the responses became more elaborate. The sonar arrays detected slight alterations in shape beneath the hull. What had been a shadow became angular, symmetrical, deliberate. The creature's movements were not chaotic, they mirrored comprehension. Smaller shapes, faster-moving scouts, darted in precise formations, maintaining a visual and sonar contact with the primary mass. The intelligence orchestrated everything: the trench, the water, the minor currents, even the crew's physiological reactions. Every pulse, every wave, every microcurrent was part of a language humans were only beginning to decipher. The psychological effect on the crew was profound. Insomnia, sudden panic attacks, and vertigo set in. But this was no mere fear. It was a communication, too subtle to hear, encoded directly into their sensory perception. Human minds were being tested for limits. Stress was measured, reactions were cataloged. Every pause in conversation, every glance at the sonar screen, every tremor in the hull was observed and responded to with precision. The ship itself became a living participant in this first contact, a medium through which the entity studied and shaped human behavior. The first fully interpretable sequence came as a revelation. The pulses repeated in a manner that suggested a structured message, a cautionary greeting. You are seen, the patterns implied. You are noted. The captain, staring at the display, whispered, It's acknowledging us." That acknowledgement carried a weight heavier than steel. Recognition by something ancient and intelligent was a concept humans could hardly comprehend, let alone react to. The crew felt simultaneously insignificant and infinitely scrutinized. And then came the twist. The communication evolved. It was no longer reactive, it initiated. Sequences appeared without human prompting, faster, more intricate, layering sub-patterns atop main sequences. The implication was clear: the intelligence had begun to teach, manipulate, and direct the humans, not with words, not with aggression, but through expectation and consequence. Every pulse conveyed not only presence, but authority. The message was unmistakable. This was a ruler speaking through the medium of water, and the Artemis 9 floated directly above its throne. Attempts to respond in kind escalated the tension. Sonar pulses, carefully constructed, were sent back as queries. Almost immediately, responses arrived, mirrored, corrected, amplified. The entity below adapted to human strategy in real time, a predator capable of learning before action, adjusting not reactively, but proactively. Each human attempt to interpret or influence the sequence was met with a corresponding adaptation, a challenge, a silent interrogation. No life form known to man had ever demonstrated this combination of scale, cognition, and patience. The crew began to realize that first contact wasn't about fear or survival, it was about comprehension. Humans were being assessed for their ability to understand communication, pattern recognition, and ultimately, restraint. The entity did not need to kill to dominate, it only needed to see how humans would respond when faced with something vast, older than civilization, and entirely unconcerned with our expectations. Finally, the return pulses carried a subtle, terrifying implication. The intelligence below was not limited to the trench. It was networked, coordinated. Every current, every minor formation of smaller creatures, every reflected sonar wave appeared to be integrated into a single deliberate framework. Communication was no longer passive, it was a system-wide orchestration, suggesting not only self-awareness, but societal behavior. Humanity had expected a single predator. Instead, the crew was witnessing an apex intelligence operating as both individual and collective, simultaneously testing, teaching, and surveilling. The first clear, undeniable contact concluded with a pattern that repeated slowly, methodically, a sequence that seemed almost like punctuation, a closing of a sentence written in water and sound. The AI interpreted it as intentional closure, a pause allowing the humans to respond. But the human mind struggled to process the full scope. Recognition, patience, and judgment had been demonstrated in a form incomprehensible, leaving the crew both awed and horrified. The entity had not attacked, it had not displayed teeth or violence, yet the message was far clearer than any scream. They were being watched, evaluated, understood, and somewhere in the... It was a moment no one on the Artemis 9 would ever forget or survive unscarred in a memory. For hours, the ship had drifted in silence, suspended over the trench, surrounded by the deep black of the ocean, listening. The first communications had shifted from subtle pulses to structured responses, each wave a demonstration of intelligence, power, and patience. And then, just as the crew began to feel the unbearable weight of expectation, the sonar picked up a new anomaly, something not reflected in normal acoustic patterns, not a mass or a shadow, but a subtle void in the water column. The technician was the first to speak, voice barely above a whisper. It's looking at us. The words seemed absurd until the camera drones, lowered carefully into the darkness, captured the impossible. At first, there was nothing, just black water filled with a drifting particulate, the only light the pale cones from the drone. Then a shape began to form, not moving like any known creature, but unfolding as if reality itself bent to reveal it. The enormous mass of the Megalodon, or whatever it had become, resolved into an outline, colossal and grotesque, yet almost ethereal. And then slowly, impossibly, an eye opened. It was a mistake to look. The eye was bigger than the drone, bigger than the ship itself, at least in perceived scale. Ancient scars radiated from its pupil like jagged lightning, etched into skin tougher than armor and darker than the blackness around it. Yet there was something else, something humanly incomprehensible. Intellect, awareness, judgment. The crew didn't just see it, they felt it. A pressure, a mental weight pressing down through the hull, through the water, through their very bones, as though the creature's mind had reached out and measured them one by one. Silence on the bridge turned into an oppressive, suffocating thing. Even breathing seemed loud. The AI attempted to analyze the image, but its neural nets collapsed repeatedly under the scale of the anomaly. Data models failed, depth calculations were meaningless. This eye, this single aperture into the abyss, did not obey physics as they understood it. The image on the drone feed flickered, distorted, yet every flicker reinforced one undeniable truth. They were being assessed, not for attack, not for territory, but as specimens, curiosities, perhaps even as experiments. The first words, or thoughts, did not come in human language. No sound emanated through the water, no vibrations hit the sonar in predictable patterns, and yet everyone on board felt it. A mental pulse, subtle but unmistakable, resonating through perception, cognition, instinct, fear, confusion, recognition. One of the younger crew members gasped aloud, pressing both hands to her ears, shaking her head. It, it knows we're thinking, she stammered. Others nodded, wide-eyed, their own brains screaming with the same horrifying realization. The Megalodon was not just alive, it was aware. It had understood the experiments, the patterns, the intentions, and it had decided that mere observation was insufficient. The eye tracked them with impossible precision. When crew members moved, it moved, not physically, but in terms of its gaze, its orientation, as if the water itself bent around it to maintain perspective. When the sonar operator adjusted the scan, the eye's focus shifted subtly, aligning with the new perspective before any human had time to react. This was not reflex, this was cognition, proactive understanding. Then came the first deliberate act. A small drone, still hovering near the trench edge, suddenly trembled. The water around it twisted unnaturally, the current bending in ways that made no physical sense. The drone tilted violently, and for the first time, the Megalodon's eye narrowed, or at least gave the impression of focus. It was not curiosity alone, this was testing, assessing, probing. And then, without touching it, the drone corrected itself, moving upright as if allowed to live, but only after compliance. The implications struck everyone like lightning. This was not mindless predator. This was a ruler, an entity with judgment, with rules, with deliberate restraint. Killing was optional. Observing was mandatory. Humanity was being measured not for aggression, not for survival, but for its very capacity to comprehend and respond. And then the eye blinked. Not like a human blink, not like any animal blink. The eyelid, or the equivalent, closed slowly, deliberately, as if granting temporary reprieve. The crew felt the release immediately, the pressure in their chests, the vibration in their skulls, the unshakable sense of being observed, all diminished slightly. But the relief was hollow. The blink was not mercy, it was instruction. They had been seen, assessed, and permitted to continue for now, but only until the next test. The first direct observation was even more horrifying when the eye fully opened again. It wasn't alone. Smaller silhouettes emerged around it. Scouts, sentinels, subordinates, all moving in perfect coordination, invisible to sonar, but present. The main eye's gaze seemed to control them, orchestrating the environment like a conductor, bending the currents, shaping the water, even subtly influencing the ship's motion. Every microcosm of the trench became an instrument of perception, a demonstration of dominance, expressed without violence. The crew could no longer ignore it. Psychological terror replaced mere fear. Sleep became impossible. Every shadow on the ship seemed infused with the creature's attention. Every shift in water pressure, every creak of steel felt like a conscious signal. The line between reality and hallucination blurred. Some crew members began whispering that the eye had communicated directly into their minds, thoughts and images that could not have come from themselves, warnings, commands, cryptic impressions of scale, age, and intelligence incomprehensible to human cognition. One of the medical officers, scanning heart rates and cortisol levels, muttered under his breath, "It's teaching us fear. Not just fear of death, fear of being understood." He was right. The terror was not physical, it was existential. The Megalodon's awareness was a mirror, reflecting humanity's own insignificance back at them with clinical precision. And then, the final twist. The eye began to respond to attempts to communicate. Sonar pulses sent towards it, carefully measured and deliberate, were not merely ignored or reflected, they were altered, corrected, mirrored, and returned. A pattern emerged, suggesting deliberate dialogue, an exchange of signals designed to teach, test, and evaluate comprehension. This was not language in any human sense, but it was communication, a first conversation. The crew understood the stakes immediately. This was not survival, this was comprehension. Humanity had been seen for the first time by something truly ancient, and the rules were simple: understand, obey, or suffer the consequences. Any mistake, any misreading, any misinterpretation could be fatal, not by brute force, but by the entity's inexorable, patient intelligence. For hours, the eye remained open, observing every crew member, every action, every attempt to respond. The ship became a stage, a testing ground. Every movement, every blink, every breath was cataloged, and still no attack came. That was the final horror: restraint. The power to destroy and the patience to wait, the judgment to assess, the intelligence to orchestrate every outcome. The Megalodon was no predator in the human sense. It was something far older and far more terrifying, a ruler in its domain, evaluating the invaders with calm, deliberate calculation. When the eye finally receded into the darkness, the ship remained untouched, the crew left trembling, awed, and irreparably altered. The first direct observation had ended, but the psychological imprint was permanent. Humanity had glimpsed intelligence older than history itself. It had been measured, and it had survived, for now. Somewhere below, the other eyes opened too, and the deep waited. The Artemis 9 had floated above the trench, suspended in a silence so complete that the crew's own breathing seemed thunderous. For hours, the sonar readings, the mental pulses, and the impossible eye had defined the ship's perception of reality. The sense of being studied, of being measured, had left them tense, silent, and on the edge of panic. But they were still in control, still operational. That illusion of control ended abruptly. It began with a subtle fluctuation in the electrical systems. Lights flickered across the bridge, screens dimmed, and monitors displaying sonar returns shimmered briefly before stabilizing. Crew members exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether this was a technical glitch or the trench itself affecting the systems. Then, without warning, the lights went out entirely, leaving the bridge in darkness so complete that the stars above the clouds were invisible. Emergency backup lighting attempted to engage, but failed. The hum of the engines dropped as if the ship itself were sinking into blackness. Panic set in immediately. Hands moved blindly over panels. Engineers scrambled to restart the reactors, to reroute power, to regain a semblance of order. Every attempt was met with failure. Systems that should have remained operational, life support, navigation, communications, stuttered and died. The ship's AI, normally calm and precise, went silent. Even the backup manual controls refused input, responding sluggishly or not at all. The Artemis 9 was adrift, suspended above a trench that had ceased to obey any rules the crew understood. The first thought, shared in whispers across the bridge, was mechanical failure. But the data suggested something impossible. Systems were not destroyed, they were overridden. Subtle energy fluctuations, pulses in the water around the hull, seemed to match the frequency of the communications that had come from the trench. It was as if the environment itself had become an interface. The water, the pressure, the very molecules surrounding the vessel were manipulated by something intelligent, something vast, and something ancient. The crew realized the terrible truth. The blackout was not accidental. It was deliberate. Fear became tangible. Heart rates skyrocketed. The youngest engineer, barely 23, began sobbing openly, whispering that the ship had become a prison in the water. The captain, normally composed, barked orders, trying to maintain structure, but no command had any effect. Systems did not respond. Even radios remained dead. Somewhere below, the Megalodon, or whatever it was, had assumed control, not just of the physical ocean, but of the instruments humans relied upon. The first true horror came when the water around the ship seemed to thicken. Not physically, not in a way measurable by density meters, but perceptually. Every crew member felt an almost gravitational weight pressing down through the deck. The hull vibrated subtly, a deep, resonant pulse, like the heartbeat of something massive. The pulse synchronized with the ship's own systems, or rather the absence of systems, creating a rhythm that suggested a sentient orchestration. It was a message without words, a declaration of dominance. Attempts to illuminate the deck were futile. Emergency lights failed, portable flashlights cast nothing beyond the immediate cone, and the water outside swallowed even the faintest beams. Shadows moved where they should not, subtle distortions of perception that suggested massive forms circling just beyond the visible range. Sonar, manually reactivated, displayed incomprehensible readings, gaps in the data, phantom masses larger than the vessel itself, and echoes that suggested movement at impossible speeds. Then came the psychological assault. Without the ship's electronic systems to filter them, crew members began experiencing the same dreams, awake in real time, standing on deck, staring into the abyss, feeling enormous eyes observing from the darkness below. Some felt themselves sinking into the water while standing upright. Others felt vibrations in their skulls, pressure against their chest, the sensation of being touched without contact. It was subtle but undeniable, a direct manipulation of perception and nervous systems. One of the medics screamed when he perceived a hand brushing against his shoulder, though no one was nearby. Others reported whispers in their ears, not sounds in the air, but internalized, as if the trench itself were speaking into the mind. The AI attempted to interpret sensor data, but all logs were corrupted, replaced with incomprehensible patterns. The blackout was not just physical, it was cognitive. The entity below had assumed control over what the humans could perceive, what the systems could report, and how they could interpret reality itself. The tension escalated further when small objects began moving without explanation. Papers floated in the air, tools shifted subtly on benches, water currents inside open pipes swirled against natural motion. Nothing was violent, yet every motion carried intent. It was a silent assertion. I control this space. You do not. Every micro-event was a test of awareness, composure, and reaction. The crew realized with dawning horror that the Megalodon was not merely observing, they were participating in an experiment orchestrated from the trench. The captain attempted to issue orders verbally, but words felt hollow. Some crew members froze mid-sentence, struck by sudden vertigo, nausea, or dizziness. Patterns of microgravity shifts and pressure pulses seemed to correspond with their emotional states, as if the trench, or the entity below it, were calibrating its influence to maximum psychological effect. The ship itself became an instrument of terror. In a last-ditch effort, the engineers tried to manually disconnect the main reactor from the computer network. Sparks flew, panels overloaded, every attempt to regain control failed. Then the sensors picked up an impossible reading, a massive, slow-moving pulse ascending from below, far larger than anything the sonar could have reasonably measured. The pulse radiated upward, reaching the hull with a vibration that felt more like thought than energy. The crew had no way to measure its scale accurately, yet they knew instinctively that it was vast, colossal beyond comprehension. The eye had returned. Not visible, not directly, but its presence was undeniable. Pressure waves aligned with previous communications, and the mental sensation of observation intensified. Every person aboard felt scrutinized individually. Decisions, movements, thoughts, all were being cataloged, evaluated, and responded to instantly. No aggression had occurred yet, but the power dynamic was absolute. Humanity, suspended above the abyss, was helpless, fully exposed, and entirely at the mercy of an intelligence older than civilization itself. Minutes stretched like hours. Some crew members began crying, some muttered prayers, others sat silently, staring at invisible horizons. All felt a shared terror. They were no longer in control. Survival was irrelevant. The Megalodon had assumed full authority over both perception and environment. The blackout was not accidental. It was the first message in the language of dominance. When the lights flickered briefly, they revealed nothing outside, only the reflection of terrified faces in the bridge windows. And then darkness returned, deeper than before, thick with intent. Every crew member understood they were now captives, witnesses to an intelligence that did not need weapons to assert supremacy. It could manipulate the environment, the ship, and even their perception of reality. The trench had become a theater, the ship its stage, and they the unwilling actors. For the first time, the captain admitted to himself what the entire crew already felt. The Megalodon did not need to attack to demonstrate power. All it needed was control, and it had it completely. Humanity's confidence, their technology, their comprehension, all were meaningless against an intelligence that operated on a scale and in a medium beyond human mastery. As the blackout continued, subtle signals returned, micro-pulses in water pressure, minute vibrations in hull plating, the unmistakable sensation of massive movement just beyond perception. The crew was aware, helpless, and utterly dominated. Every second reinforced the same lesson. Survival depended not on force, but on restraint, comprehension, and the mercy of a ruler older and more powerful than anything humanity had ever faced. By the time the Artemis 9 finally regained partial system function, lights flickering weakly, navigation arrays returning barely coherent data, the psychological damage had been done. The crew was irrevocably altered. They had experienced a direct demonstration of intelligence beyond humanity's understanding, a power that did not need to destroy to dominate. And somewhere in the trench below, the Megalodon, or rather the apex intelligence that humanity had just met, continued to watch, waiting, calculating, and judging every thought, movement, and reaction. The system blackout was over, physically, but its effects endured. The ship had survived, the crew had survived, but the abyss had spoken, and it would. The Artemis 9 did not return as it had departed. When it was finally located, months later, it drifted in the same trenchless stretch of ocean that had swallowed it into darkness. Satellite tracking showed only brief, erratic blips before it vanished from all official monitoring systems. By the time recovery teams arrived, the ship was silent, inert, and impossibly pristine. There were no signs of damage, no hull breaches, no evidence of fire, no signs of struggle, but something was unmistakably wrong. The first boarding team approached cautiously. Military protocol demanded preparation for hostile intervention, chemical contamination, or psychological hazards. None applied. The vessel was empty, yet it carried the oppressive weight of presence. The hatches were unlocked, the bridge lights dead, yet the atmosphere pressed down on the team with a subtle, inexplicable gravity. No one spoke at first. Words felt invasive in a space saturated with the memory of the unknown. Inside, the corridors were unnervingly clean. Personal effects remained in place. Cups half filled, charts scattered as if the crew had paused mid-motion. Even logs, meticulously maintained, contained no records of what happened in the trench beyond cryptic entries, pressure anomalies detected, contact established, responsive, and one entry scrawled in haste, "It knows. Everything. We are being measured." The handwriting was shaky and the entries ended abruptly mid-sentence. There were no further logs. No human presence was evident. No footprints, no bodies, no signs of escape. Every station remained as if left by the crew only moments ago, yet there was an undeniable emptiness. The first recovery officer muttered that the ship felt alive in the absence of life. He was not exaggerating. Every corridor, every hatchway seemed to hum with a subtle vibration, a residue of the enormous intelligence that had dominated the vessel. The ship itself appeared to have retained traces of the Megalodon's influence. The bridge was the most horrifying. Monitors flickered faintly, displaying sequences of sonar returns that no team could interpret. The massive contact remained in the simulations, partially rendered, partially corrupted, as though the data had been deliberately left incomplete. Logs from the crew computers contained irregularities, encrypted files, inaccessible subdirectories, and corrupted data clusters that, when probed, emitted faint rhythmic pulses, eerily similar to the communication patterns detected months earlier. It was as if the intelligence had left a signature, a message encoded into the very systems. Personal effects offered only more questions. Crew journals recorded detailed observations of behavior, both human and non-human, but ended abruptly. No last entries described panic, escape, or attack. Instead, the logs detailed careful study, observations of sonar anomalies, movements of the massive entity below, and descriptions of what seemed to be direct mental impressions. The final notes indicated that the crew had begun to feel watched, measured, and tested, yet no evidence existed as to how or why they vanished. Recovery teams searched every compartment: the galley, the sleeping quarters, the engineering bays. Empty. The emergency rations remained untouched, yet evidence suggested recent human activity: warm coffee mugs, half-used notebooks, and scattered clothing. There were no signs of struggle, yet the psychological tension embedded in the environment made even the most hardened personnel uneasy. It was as if the ship itself remembered the events of the trench and carried them in some subtle, imperceptible way. Attempts to access ship communications were met with impossibility. All data transmissions had been blocked or overwritten. The last recorded ping to naval monitoring systems was months before, corresponding with the vessel's first disappearance from official tracking systems. Subsequent attempts to interface with the navigation system produced gibberish. Coordinates traced by the team showed the ship had never traveled along any recognized oceanic route after disappearing. It had lingered somewhere in a deep, unmapped trench before drifting to its final location, untouched by currents that should have carried it far from the spot. The most disturbing discovery came from the sonar and environmental monitoring logs. Analysts reported that the last readings contained impossible phenomena: pressure waves exceeding known physical limits, voids in the water column, and echoes that suggested a mass larger than the ship itself. These readings matched descriptions of the Megalodon's presence, as reported by the crew logs. In other words, the intelligence had been present until the very last operational data point, and then gone. Or perhaps it had never left. Psychological evaluation of the recovery team revealed immediate and severe effects. Panic, vertigo, nausea, and hallucinations were common. Several members reported feeling a presence aboard the vessel, subtle but undeniable, a sense of being observed or judged by something vast and unseen. Even months later, personnel remained haunted by memories of the ship's corridors, the corrupted sonar logs, and the eerie sensation that something had intentionally vacated the vessel, but not the space itself. Theories proliferated. Some suggested that the crew had been abducted by the Megalodon, taken into the abyss for study or examination. Others hypothesized that the intelligence had interfaced with human minds directly, leaving the bodies aboard the ship in some suspended state, or perhaps erasing them entirely. No evidence supported any single theory, and yet the emptiness of the Artemis 9 screamed of deliberate, intelligent action. Physical evidence offered no answers. Hull inspections revealed no breaches, no dents, no trace of environmental damage. Yet structural sensors recorded microstrains, consistent with a massive, moving presence nearby. Analysis suggested that the creature, or creatures, had moved with such precision that no collision occurred, no stress was imparted beyond what was subtly detectable. The implication was clear. The Megalodon's intelligence allowed for absolute control of scale and movement, dominance without destruction. Inside the ship, subtle anomalies persisted. Environmental systems, restored temporarily, began recording slight fluctuations in temperature and pressure without explanation. Noise sensors picked up irregular acoustic patterns, faint pulses that bore the same rhythmic signature as the earlier sonar communications. It was as if the vessel had retained a memory of the entity, a latent impression embedded in its systems. Analysts describe it as a psychic echo, though the term felt inadequate. The intelligence had left something behind, a proof, subtle yet undeniable, of its presence and its comprehension. Personal logs of the crew suggested attempts to communicate with the entity before their disappearance. Entries described coded sonar pings, sequences of light flashes, and intentional behavioral tests. Observations indicated the crew recognized the intelligence as deliberate and capable of assessment, but the logs ended abruptly mid-sentence, implying that the communication reached a point of mutual understanding, or decision, that the humans could not survive or fully interpret. By the time the Artemis 9 was towed to a naval staging area, the vessel had already entered legend. Recovery teams refused to stay aboard for extended periods. Personnel reported anxiety, panic attacks, and a shared sense of dread when even briefly on the ship. Attempts to replicate the conditions of the trench, sonar pings, acoustic tests, were met with inexplicable system interference. In short, the ship itself had become a vessel of terror, haunted not by ghosts, but the latent presence of the Megalodon's intelligence. The final chilling realization came from an analysis of the vessel's route and environmental interactions. Coordinates traced from residual logs suggested the ship had maintained an impossible proximity to the trench after disappearing, moving in a pattern consistent with awareness of the abyss below. Any deviation in course appeared deliberate, as though guided by some unseen hand or consciousness. The implication was clear. The vessel itself had become a participant in the entity's experiment, a controlled environment designed to observe and manipulate human perception. When the media reported the recovery, the official statement was sterile. Vessel recovered, crew missing, investigation ongoing. Behind the scenes, higher authorities understood the implications. The Artemis 9 had been in contact with an intelligence vast, ancient, and fully aware. The crew had vanished, leaving behind a ship imbued with a lingering presence, an imprint of observation, dominance, and judgment. Analysts speculated that contact with the abyssal intelligence might be permanent. Despite protocols and classified containment measures, stories spread. Whispered accounts of the ship's eerie condition, of faint pulses echoing in the hull, of the suffocating weight of being watched. Maritime legends grew, warning that the trench was no ordinary abyss. It was a domain, ruled by something that not only survived extinction, but had mastered comprehension, strategy, and psychological dominance. The Artemis 9 was no longer a vessel, it was a warning, a fragment of knowledge left deliberately in human hands, an unanswerable proof of intelligence beyond measure.
By the end, the Artemis 9 sat docked, empty.
The discovery came quietly, almost accidentally. Months after the recovery of the Artemis 9, a deep-sea survey team was deployed to study the trench where the vessel had vanished and reappeared. Officially, the mission was to gather data on the anomalous sonar readings, pressure anomalies, and geological inconsistencies reported by the Artemis 9 crew before their disappearance. But what they found was no mere anomaly. It was a deliberate, horrifying message. The first signs were subtle. Drone feeds revealed unnatural formations on the trench floor, linear depressions, perfectly aligned ridges, and symmetrical patterns that defied natural explanation. The shapes were enormous, stretching hundreds of meters in length, impossible for any known animal to construct. Initial geologists speculated tectonic or volcanic activity, but sonar scans revealed something more deliberate. The patterns were too precise, too methodical, and aligned in ways that suggested intentional design. As the drones approached closer, the full scale became apparent. The patterns formed shapes that resembled symbols, but not human symbols. Geometry existed, yes, but it was alien in nature, perfectly engineered in 3 dimensions, taking advantage of depth, shadows, and light in ways no human architect could reproduce underwater. It was not a message in language, it was a message in scale, perspective, and impossible logic. Whoever or whatever had made it understood perception itself. Then came the first direct proof. Claw-like gouges, massive enough to scar the trench floor, arranged in sequences that matched the sonar communication patterns from the Artemis 9 logs. Analysts on the support vessel quickly cross-referenced the frequencies, timing, and sequences, and a chilling realization emerged. The patterns were deliberate. They mirrored the pulse codes detected months earlier, suggesting the same intelligence that had studied the Artemis 9 was now leaving a physical signature, a carved message in the ocean itself. The message was more than proof of intelligence. It was a challenge. It demonstrated that the Megalodon, or its network, had not only survived, but evolved in ways that allowed manipulation of the environment on a grand scale. Every ridge, groove, and indentation followed precise geometric rules, producing subtle optical illusions when viewed from certain angles. Drones that attempted to map the area from directly above reported distortion in visual and sonar feeds, as if the structure itself resisted measurement. The deeper the team explored, the more explicit the carvings became. Some depressions resembled enormous eyes, staring up into the abyss, perfectly aligned with the expected paths of drones. Others resembled vast coils, spiraling in a Fibonacci-like pattern, stretching so long that no single camera could capture the entirety in one frame. The arrangements were too regular, too intentional to be accidental. They were a signature, a declaration, a proof that the intelligence below could manipulate scale, space, and perception at will. Then came the terrifying pattern, a formation unmistakably representing the Artemis 9 itself. The lines traced the contours of the ship, its bridge, the layout of internal corridors, down to details only known to the crew. Scientists initially assumed a coincidence, but further analysis revealed something impossible. The trench's formations reflected recent movements of the vessel in real time when compared to historical navigation logs. It was as if the Megalodon had reconstructed the ship, or at least its spatial memory, on a massive scale. The team aboard the survey vessel reported immediate psychological effects. Crew members described feelings of being watched, whispers in their minds, sudden vertigo, and faint pressure sensations across the body. Some swore the trenches themselves seemed alive, subtly moving, reshaping, responding to their presence. Even the most skeptical engineers reported distortions in sonar feedback, as if the very medium of the water had been manipulated. The implications were clear and horrifying.
This was not merely a creature of size and instinct. This was a sentient intelligence capable of observation, environmental manipulation, and communication. And now it had proven the ability to extend its awareness beyond the ship itself, leaving a deliberate, unambiguous mark for humanity to find. Attempts to document the carvings in detail proved nearly impossible. Cameras malfunctioned, sonar returns distorted, and drones occasionally lost signal entirely. When viewed from certain angles, the formations appeared to shift, subtly adjusting to the perspective of the observer. Analysts began to speculate that the Megalodon, or collective intelligence, was actively interacting with observation tools, influencing cognition itself. The message was not static, it was adaptive, a living proof of intelligence capable of understanding and manipulating cognition. Then came the final piece, the sequence that confirmed intent beyond doubt. Certain gouges formed patterns resembling coded repetitions, reflecting the same adaptive pulse sequences first encountered by the Artemis 9. Each line, each indentation mirrored the sonar frequencies, rhythmically echoing back the signals the humans had once sent. It was a callback, a deliberate acknowledgement. The entity not only understood the humans' technology and behavior, but had responded in a way that could only be interpreted as conscious, intelligent communication. Scientists aboard the vessel were left speechless. The enormity of the realization sank in. The Megalodon was aware of humanity's perception, capable of reconstructing it, manipulating it, and leaving a deliberate, incomprehensible message to prove both its presence and its superiority. The ocean trench was no longer a passive environment. It was a canvas for an intelligence far older and more sophisticated than any human mind could comprehend. The team attempted to send signals back, deploying sonar pulses mimicking the sequences embedded in the carvings. For hours, they received no response. Then, subtly, the water itself seemed to change. Currents shifted inexplicably. Pressure readings fluctuated in ways that reflected the original pulse frequencies. The message was alive. The trench, or the intelligence controlling it, responded on its own terms, teaching the observers how to read, how to measure, how to perceive. The psychological impact intensified. Crew members reported hallucinations of massive shapes moving just beyond vision, whispering sequences into their minds. Some felt phantom pressure against their chests, while others claimed to see eyes embedded in the trench walls, following every movement. Even the scientists recording data felt as if the trench itself was evaluating them, measuring reactions to the carved message. This was not horror born of danger, it was horror born of understanding. Humanity had witnessed intelligence beyond comprehension, and its message carried judgment. The carvings suggested scale beyond reason, intelligence beyond calculation, and patience beyond human experience. Each formation reinforced the fact that the Megalodon's awareness was not local, not temporal, but pervasive. It had watched the humans, understood their tools, observed their thought processes, and left proof of its observation for later discovery. It was a warning, a proof, and a challenge all at once. By the time the survey vessel departed, the trench remained unchanged. The carvings persisted, massive and indecipherable in their totality. Attempts to map or replicate them were thwarted at every turn. Sonar distortions, optical illusions, and subtle manipulations of perception ensured that only fragments could be recorded. Those fragments, however, were enough to prove beyond doubt that the intelligence had left a deliberate, carved message, one that humanity could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. The legacy of the Artemis 9 and the carved message became a chilling testament. Scientists and military officials recognized a terrifying reality. Contact with the Megalodon was no longer speculation. Humanity had proof, encoded in water, pressure, and impossible geometry, that intelligence in the deep sea surpassed human comprehension, patience, and dominance. The message was clear. The Megalodon had not forgotten. It had not fled. It had left a signature, a deliberate marker of awareness, and it continued to watch. The message carved in the trench was not merely a warning, it was a communication from an intelligence that existed beyond time and scale, one that had measured humanity, understood its tools, observed its thought processes, and declared its presence in a form impossible to ignore. And somewhere in the crushing depths below, the Megalodon waited, patient and aware, ready for the next encounter, its message a living testament to power beyond comprehension.
The world did not notice at first. Ships went missing in isolated regions, deep-sea research vessels recorded impossible sonar readings, and fishing trawlers reported massive shadows beneath the waves. But governments dismissed these incidents as accidents, equipment failures, or exaggerations. Yet beneath the surface, the abyss was awakening. The intelligence that had observed the Artemis 9 had not acted alone. It had been joined, or perhaps always existed as, a network of massive predators, megalodons whose awareness extended across oceans, whose movements were coordinated, deliberate, and intelligent. It began subtly in the Pacific. A deep-sea mining operation reported unusual pressure fluctuations and structural stress far beyond natural causes. Sonar scans revealed enormous shapes, moving faster than any known animal and appearing to communicate with one another through patterns of movement and water pressure. Drones sent to investigate either malfunctioned inexplicably or returned footage corrupted beyond analysis, as if the creatures themselves were manipulating perception. The operation's crew reported hallucinations, vertigo, and overwhelming dread, all consistent with prior experiences near the trench where the Artemis 9 had disappeared. Then came the first undeniable attack, or rather a demonstration of power. A supertanker navigating the Indian Ocean reported massive turbulence beneath its hull, followed by a localized, sudden blackout of all electronic systems. Crew members described a sensation of being watched, followed by eerie pressure waves that seemed to shape their movements. The vessel remained physically intact, yet the mental and emotional toll left the crew incapacitated. It was the same intelligence pattern observed in the Artemis 9 incident, now replicated on a global scale. Naval intelligence struggled to process the data. Reports flooded in. Sonar readings of enormous creatures in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Southern Oceans, disappearances of unmanned research drones, sudden, inexplicable failures of communication cables on the seafloor. Analysis revealed a terrifying pattern. These were not isolated events. The movements of the megalodons were coordinated, occurring simultaneously across thousands of miles. Every sighting, every system failure, and every psychological effect appeared synchronized, suggesting a global intelligence with reach, perception, and foresight far beyond human capability. Civilian and commercial vessels began reporting encounters, sometimes leaving behind vague visual evidence, giant shadows, massive shapes breaching near ships, or deep-sea disturbances registered on sonar. Many dismissed the accounts, but independent research teams compiled corroborative evidence. The scale of the creatures, their speed, and their behavior all suggested a calculated intelligence rather than random predation. The intelligence observed in the trench had multiplied, or at least had counterparts, and now humanity faced not a single apex predator, but a worldwide network of them. The public, initially unaware, began to panic when viral videos and leaked naval footage surfaced. Footage of enormous dorsal fin-like shapes moving in deep water, sequences of sonar returns showing impossible scale, and glimpses of immense reflective eyes that suggested awareness.
Social media amplified these images, blending fact with fear, and panic spread faster than any coordinated warning could. Scientists warned that the creatures demonstrated not only size, but intelligence, strategic movement, and adaptability, making them unpredictable and uncontrollable. Global shipping routes were affected first. Cargo vessels and tankers altered courses to avoid reported sightings, but even remote areas were not safe. Coastal cities experienced unusual oceanic phenomena, sudden violent currents, tidal anomalies, and inexplicable acoustic disturbances. Naval fleets attempted coordinated tracking, but every sonar ping, every probe, seemed anticipated. In multiple regions, ships reported complete systems failures, mirroring the Artemis 9 blackout, but on larger scales and simultaneously, suggesting that the Megalodon's intelligence had become a global-scale manipulator of water, pressure, and technology. The creature's intelligence became evident in their actions. Unlike traditional predators, they did not hunt randomly. They assessed, observed, and manipulated human activity. Cargo ships remained largely untouched unless provoked. Research vessels experienced psychological assault without physical harm, and naval fleets were consistently outmaneuvered without direct aggression. It was not malice, it was dominance, evaluation, and demonstration. Humanity was being tested on a planetary scale, and the megalodons had the patience to wait while observation and measurement continued. The scientific community began to recognize patterns. The creatures moved in coordinated formations, communicated via subtle pressure waves, and manipulated currents to maximize observation of human activity. Areas of high human activity, like shipping lanes or research zones, experienced more frequent disturbances. Remote, unpopulated regions were ignored. This indicated a deliberate strategy, one that relied on understanding human behavior and predicting response, an intelligence more patient and strategic than any terrestrial predator. Psychological terror escalated worldwide. Crew members on vessels reported faint voices in their minds, phantom touches, pressure anomalies, and hallucinations. Submarine crews experienced collective hallucinations, with multiple personnel reporting seeing massive eyes observing them, shadows larger than the submarine itself, and patterns in sonar returns that suggested comprehension and intent. The intelligence demonstrated awareness not only of location, but of human perception, reinforcing fear without physical contact. Governments attempted to respond militarily, deploying deep-sea drones, sonar arrays, and fleets to track the creatures, yet every attempt failed. Systems were disabled without explanation, drones malfunctioned mid-deployment, and naval fleets reported sensory anomalies consistent with prior incidents. It became increasingly clear that human technology, even at the most advanced level, was ineffective against an intelligence that understood and manipulated the very medium it inhabited: water, pressure, sound, and perception itself. Economically, the impact was severe. Shipping delays, unexplained losses, and public fear disrupted global trade. Fishing operations halted, coastal cities evacuated, and scientific research projects were abandoned due to safety concerns. Insurance companies refused coverage for oceanic travel, and naval resources were stretched thin as multiple nations attempted independent tracking and containment. Yet every effort seemed anticipated, countered, or rendered ineffective. The Megalodon's network operated with coordination beyond comprehension. By the time international authorities convened, the scale of the threat became undeniable. Multiple independent reports confirmed the presence of enormous creatures in every major ocean, each displaying signs of intelligence, awareness, and deliberate strategy. Analysis revealed that the creatures could communicate, manipulate environmental conditions, and anticipate human response. Traditional warfare or containment strategies were futile. Humanity faced an intelligence that did not fight like a predator, but observed, measured, and controlled without violence. Some researchers proposed that the megalodons were a collective intelligence, operating as nodes within a global system. Observations suggested coordination in real time, indicating awareness beyond individual perception. Every blackout, every sonar distortion, and every psychological effect seemed synchronized, as if the intelligence had predicted human response before action. Humanity had moved from encountering a single apex predator to facing a worldwide network of consciousness spanning the planet's oceans. In multiple regions, civilian vessels reported similar phenomena: subtle current manipulations, enormous shapes glimpsed beneath the waves, and sonar anomalies mirroring the adaptive sequences first encountered by the Artemis 9. All confirmed that the intelligence had extended its presence, that observation was global, and that human activity was being measured, manipulated, and evaluated at a scale previously unimaginable. By this point, panic had reached critical levels. Social media propagated viral accounts of encounters, often distorted by fear, but backed by real-world anomalies. Governments imposed restrictions on oceanic travel, and scientists began to. By the time international forces and scientific teams coordinated a response, the megalodons had demonstrated their complete mastery of the oceans. Traditional naval strategies, submarines, sonar sweeps, deep-sea drones, were useless. Every attempt at containment, communication, or confrontation was anticipated, neutralized, or rendered irrelevant. The megalodons were not predators in the human sense. They were patient, intelligent, and entirely beyond comprehension. Humanity had realized painfully that survival required adaptation, cunning, and humility. The plan, hastily devised, was audacious. Teams would converge on one of the trenches identified as a central hub of activity, the site of the first Artemis 9 encounter. Using modified stealth submarines, unmanned deep-sea drones, and experimental sonar interference devices, the goal was simple: gather irrefutable evidence of the megalodon's intelligence, document their behavior, and, if possible, escape intact. Any attempt at aggression was deemed suicidal. The only hope lay in observation, subtlety, and understanding the patterns of the creature's perception. The operation began at dawn. Submarines descended into the deep with silent precision, each manned by the most skilled crews available. Drones were released in sequences designed to avoid detection: slow, measured movements, minimal sonar emissions, adaptive lighting to reduce visibility in the black ocean. Every movement, every decision was analyzed to avoid alerting the megalodons to human intent. But even as the teams approached the trench, a creeping dread settled across every vessel. The water seemed to thrum with awareness, subtle pulses echoing in hulls and nerves alike. The first sign that the megalodons were aware came not from sonar or video feeds, but from instinct. Crew members reported feeling observed, judged, and measured, even through reinforced hulls and pressure-resistant cabins. Subtle shifts in water pressure, microcurrents, and inexplicable acoustic phenomena indicated that the creature's intelligence extended beyond mere observation. They were interacting with the human's perception, shaping the environment to elicit reaction, gauging fear, anticipation, and decision-making. As the lead submarine approached the trench's edge, shadows appeared, massive, coiling, impossibly fast. Drones captured fragments of enormous forms, eyes reflecting faint light in patterns that suggested not random instinct, but calculation. The first full encounter was brief, but shattering. A megalodon, colossal beyond any prior measurement, circled the submarines at incredible speed. Systems that had once been reliable, sonar, navigation, communication, flickered and failed. The entity did not attack, it simply moved, observing every motion, every signal, every attempt at measurement. It was not aggression, it was demonstration, dominance, a proof that the creatures controlled not only the physical domain of the ocean, but the technological extensions humans relied upon. The tension on the bridge of every submarine was unbearable. Every crew member knew that any mistake, any sudden movement could provoke disaster. The megalodons were not animals. They were calculative, capable of evaluating human behavior, understanding technology, and responding with precision. Yet the operation pressed forward. Evidence had to be gathered, proof of intelligence documented, and the message delivered to humanity before the creatures vanished or retaliated. It was in this context that the first communication attempt occurred. Using modified sonar pulses mimicking patterns identified in the Artemis 9 logs, the teams attempted to speak to the intelligence. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Currents shifted violently, yet subtly, drones were jostled but not destroyed, and sonar feedback revealed patterns that mirrored the human pulses, but altered, corrected, and returned in a sequence demonstrating understanding. It was proof. The megalodons were aware, capable of comprehension, and actively engaged in this interaction. Yet the creatures were patient. They allowed observation, but tested limits. Subtle psychological assaults intensified. Crew members reported phantom touches, hallucinations of enormous eyes staring from the trench walls, and pressure waves synchronized with emotional states, fear, hope, hesitation. The intelligence evaluated not only technical attempts to communication, but the human mind itself. Decisions were measured, reactions cataloged, and missteps noted. It was an apex intelligence conducting a vast multilateral experiment with the humans as its subjects. As drones mapped the trench, evidence of previous carvings became clear. Massive formations representing vessels, lines, and pulse sequences. The megalodons had left these intentionally, a record of prior observations, warnings, and confirmations of intelligence. But now the scale was larger. New formation suggested coordination between multiple entities, creating a lattice of observation across the trench. The intelligence was no longer local, it was systemic, networked, and omnipotent within this deep domain. The climactic confrontation was not violent, but existential. One submarine, attempting to close in for direct observation, experienced total systems failure. Engines, life support, and communication ceased simultaneously. Crew members reported hallucinations of massive forms, impossible scale, and eyes everywhere, embedded in water, shadows, and even the submarine hull. The entity did not attack, but the psychological pressure was maximal. Human comprehension was overwhelmed. Fear was amplified beyond control. Any attempt to force aggression would have been catastrophic. Escape became the only option, but even withdrawal was fraught with peril. The megalodons anticipated movement, creating currents and acoustic manipulations to guide or restrict the submarine's paths. Only through extreme caution, mimicking environmental patterns, and maintaining minimal sonar and visual emissions could the submarines hope to evade detection long enough to surface safely. Every maneuver was measured, deliberate, and exhausting. Crew members described the experience as navigating a living labyrinth designed to test awareness, patience, and composure. Finally, after hours that felt like days, the submarines began to break contact. The water returned to relative calm, and technology resumed functionality incrementally. Yet the sense of observation remained. Every crew member understood that they had survived not by force, but by caution, intelligence, and humility. The megalodons had allowed observation, confirmed comprehension, and let humans escape, not because of mercy, but because their evaluation was complete. Evidence gathered during the operation was unprecedented. High-resolution sonar mapping, photographic fragments, and pulse recordings confirmed intelligence, environmental manipulation, and networked coordination. Humanity had undeniable proof. The megalodons were conscious, strategic, and capable of influencing perception and technology at will. But the encounter also confirmed a terrifying reality. Humanity could not dominate, control, or predict these beings. Any future contact would require extreme caution and respect, lest the abyss's intelligence decide otherwise. By the time the submarines surfaced, the global situation had already escalated. Reports of similar phenomena, blackouts, sonar distortions, and psychological disturbances were appearing worldwide. The encounter at the trench demonstrated that humanity had only scratched the surface of a planetary intelligence. The megalodons were everywhere, networked and patient. Observation, evaluation, and dominance were ongoing. Humanity's existence had become intertwined with an intelligence it could neither fight nor fully understand. The operation's final recordings showed a staggering detail. Multiple megalodons observed the submarines from different points, coordinating without visible communication, responding to pulses and movements with precision. It was not a predator-prey dynamic. It was an intelligence asserting global awareness, demonstrating supremacy, and communicating silently with the humans who dared to intrude. The lessons were clear. Survival required humility, patience, and understanding, not aggression. The final message, implicit and unavoidable, lingered in every crew member's mind. The Megalodon's intelligence had evaluated humanity. It had observed behavior, tested reactions, and left proof of comprehension. And yet, it had not destroyed humanity. The encounter ended not with violence, but with acknowledgement, a silent reminder of the abyss's scale, patience, and power. Humanity had survived, but the terror, the awareness, and the knowledge of a global intelligence would never leave. The operation concluded, evidence secured, and crews returned. The world would never forget the encounter, nor the chilling proof of a global intelligence beneath.
Humanity thought the confrontation at the trench was the climax, but in truth, it was only the beginning. After the global escalation and the carefully executed observation operation, the world now understood that the oceans were no longer simply a habitat, a frontier, or a resource. The oceans were a domain ruled by an intelligence that had existed long before humans ever walked the earth, an intelligence that had observed, tested, and cataloged humanity's every move. And now, the abyss's judgment was permanent, its presence undeniable, and its awareness global. In the months following the operation, reports multiplied across oceans and seas. Commercial shipping lanes experienced inexplicable delays as vessels reported massive shadows beneath them, currents that altered without meteorological cause, and electronic interference echoing the pulse patterns first documented during the Artemis 9 encounter. Coastal cities reported sudden, localized tidal anomalies, waves surging where no storm or tectonic activity existed. Deep-sea research platforms experienced simultaneous system failures, strange pressure fluctuations, and subtle acoustic patterns embedded in sonar echoes. The megalodons were everywhere. Governments scrambled to respond, but conventional methods failed. Fleets deployed in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans encountered the same impossibility: sonar blackouts, pressure anomalies, and psychological effects incapacitating personnel. Pilots of submersibles reported phantom movements of enormous shapes that were simultaneously observed in distant oceans. Attempts to attack or manipulate the creatures were ineffective. They seemed impervious to human weaponry, capable of predicting reactions, and most chillingly, aware of human perception itself. Scientists studying the phenomenon began to speculate about the scale of the intelligence.
Evidence indicated that the megalodons were networked across the planet's oceans, coordinating in ways that defied natural explanation. Patterns of movement, sonar interference, and environmental manipulation suggested not only awareness, but deliberate planning, testing, and judgment. Every encounter reinforced the terrifying realization humanity was being evaluated on a global scale, and the creature's patience exceeded comprehension. The first undeniable signs of communication, or warning, came in forms subtle but horrifying. Deep-sea drones recorded massive formations on the ocean floor, patterns of lines, depressions, and ridges stretching for kilometers, impossible in scale. Some resembled the Artemis 9, others mirrored human vessels, and still others traced sequences of sonar pulses with perfect fidelity. It was no longer a local signature, it was a planetary-level message. Humanity had been observed, understood, and now cataloged. These formations were not decorative, they were statements, proofs of presence, of intelligence, and of omnipotence. Psychological effects multiplied. Submarine crews, naval officers, and research teams reported hallucinations consistent with the Artemis 9 experience. Phantom eyes embedded in darkness, enormous shadows moving beyond perception, whispers echoing in the mind, and a crushing sensation of being observed and measured. Psychologists began diagnosing shared hallucinations across crews separated by hundreds of miles, an unprecedented phenomenon that could not be explained by contagion or mass hysteria. Humanity was experiencing the perception of an intelligence that transcended individual observation, a global-scale awareness that could manipulate both environment and cognition. The media initially reported these phenomena cautiously. Isolated stories were dismissed as exaggerations until footage leaked from multiple sources confirmed the reality. Enormous shadows beneath vessels, sonar readings exceeding known biological limits, and environmental anomalies across the planet. Public panic escalated. Maritime industries halted operations. Coastal evacuations were initiated. Deep-sea mining projects were abandoned. Every maritime activity had become a potential encounter with a consciousness older, larger, and more intelligent than humanity could comprehend. The military attempts to develop countermeasures failed spectacularly. Sonar blasts, drone attacks, and experimental weaponry had no effect. Ships experienced system failures, crew incapacitation, and inexplicable navigational disruptions. Analysts concluded that direct confrontation was impossible. The megalodons had mastered not only physical domination, but technological and psychological control. Any aggressive action was futile, and any misstep risked catastrophic consequences. Humanity's survival depended on observation, respect, and avoidance, a humbling truth for a species long accustomed to dominion over nature. The intelligence's ability to manipulate perception was the most terrifying aspect. Crews reported experiencing time distortion, spatial anomalies, and altered sensory input while near the creatures. Submarines appeared larger or smaller than they were. Drones seemed to move unpredictably, as though the water itself had become a medium of control. The megalodons were not merely predators, they were cognitive architects, capable of shaping reality within their domain, blurring the lines between perception and truth. As months passed, the megalodon's presence became impossible to ignore. Fishing industries collapsed in affected regions, shipping delays became catastrophic, and naval powers abandoned traditional oceanic patrols. Scientists began to recognize a terrifying pattern. The creatures did not attack indiscriminately. They observed, manipulated, and tested. Incidents of physical aggression were rare, yet every encounter reinforced their intelligence and dominance. Humanity had been cataloged, evaluated, and measured, and the intelligence remained patient, aware, and in control. Global monitoring initiatives attempted to predict movements, map networks, and anticipate behavior. Sonar arrays detected massive shapes coordinating across oceans, while deep-sea drones captured movements suggesting communication via pressure waves and subtle currents. The patterns were consistent. The megalodons operated collectively, coordinated on scales impossible for humans to fully track. Every effort to model their behavior revealed only one constant: unpredictability. They were aware, patient, and omnipresent. Humanity had no leverage. Amid this global realization, an unspoken terror emerged. The megalodon's intelligence had not only survived extinction, but had mastered the oceans, technology, and human perception. Humanity had never confronted a predator like this. It was not a creature of instinct, but a sentient force whose patience and scale rendered human dominance irrelevant. The world understood, collectively, that any future oceanic operation carried risk far beyond comprehension. The seas were no longer territory, they were domains of a sentient, intelligent predator. Cultural and societal effects were profound. Maritime nations began treating oceans as forbidden zones. Exploratory missions were halted. International law recognized the abyss as a no-go zone. Folklore and media embraced the terror. Viral accounts, films, and stories depicted enormous sentient predators capable of manipulation, judgment, and observation. Humanity, for the first time, acknowledged that it shared the planet with beings it could neither fight nor fully comprehend. The most chilling realization came when researchers examined historical records. Patterns suggested that these megalodons had always existed, hidden in the depths, observing the evolution of human civilization and cataloging behavior over centuries. The creature's intelligence was timeless, patient, and strategic. Humanity's modern era had only recently intersected with their awareness, triggered by deep-sea exploration, sonar activity, and environmental intrusion. The megalodons had been waiting, watching, and preparing for first contact. Efforts to communicate continued, cautiously, through adaptive sonar pulses and environmental signaling. Responses were subtle, indirect, yet unmistakable. Currents, pressure fluctuations, and sonar echoes followed human signals, but always altered, demonstrating comprehension and adaptation. The intelligence was deliberate, patient, and profoundly aware of human cognition. It did not need to destroy humanity to assert dominance. Observation, testing, and subtle control sufficed. The legacy of the Artemis 9, the trench operations, and global encounters coalesced into a chilling truth. The oceans were now recognized as a domain of sentient, intelligent predators whose patience and scale far exceeded human understanding. Humanity had survived encounters, but only barely. Every operation, every venture into deep waters carried the implicit risk of judgment. The megalodons were global, intelligent, and patient, and their presence would forever shape the way humans approached the oceans. In the final months of global monitoring, researchers documented the lasting psychological effect on survivors and observers. Crew members exhibited chronic
Like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world and helps us bring you more awesome videos. Hit that bell icon so you never miss an update.